this first rankings, for anybody that says, okay, it doesn't matter, why do people get uptight? Understandably, there's a whole lot of football left to be played, so nobody's made the playoffs yet, and nobody that's reasonably a contender has been eliminated. But at the same time, I'll make 2 points, and then you can take this wherever you want. One would be that TCU's at number 7. So TCU being at number 7 tells us a lot about what the committee thinks of them, what they think of everybody else that's in front of them, including a one-loss Alabama team. So they've set the stage for what they're talking about, how they evaluate a TCU team that has already defeated probably 2 of the 3 best teams in the conference. So they've already beaten Oklahoma State and Kansas State, and have Texas as really the one semi-marquee win left, and they don't have a whole lot except a Big 12 championship game. So if they've been shunned down to 7, that says a lot. And then the other thing that's going to tell us a lot, I think, Jason, so we're a week away from this, is the conclusion of the Tennessee-Georgia game. Let's say that's a decent game. Where does the loser drop? How far? Because the committee can drop them as far as they can drop them to a certain extent, but the way they've treated the SEC and the quality of the loss, and saying, okay, well, if you're number 1 in the country and you go on the road and you lose to the defending national champion, let's say if Tennessee loses to Georgia, none of us should be surprised if Tennessee only drops to 4 or 5. So that's going to be the telling tale for next week. That's going to continue to tell us the narrative and what they deem important. But for right now, for me, the one that stood out to me is TCU at 7.
Yeah, no, I agree, Mark, and it did me as well. I thought there was maybe a chance that you would see TCU and Alabama flip-flopped there, but I mean, it's out. No matter what criteria the committee thinks that they're looking at and what they're telling the general public. You would have a hard time actually believing that they would be willing to rank TCU ahead of Alabama just because of, hey, it's Alabama, right? And it's TCU. So I think TCU's in a tough spot, Mark. They're in a tough spot because now, to their benefit, they have Texas Tech at home this week, but then the next 2 weeks they go to Texas and then to Baylor. So, I think if they were to win those 2 games, I think maybe that gives them a little bit more credibility. Not that they shouldn't have that already, to your point with beating Oklahoma State and Kansas State, but I think the fact that if you're able to go on the road and win these games versus those games being at home, maybe that means a little bit more. But I think in terms of your comment about Tennessee, I think if it's a fairly close game, I think the point spread is like 8.5. So I think if you're within 10 points, Tennessee loses that game within 10 points. I think the how good their resume has been or is at this point, and how well they're playing, certainly right now, I think they probably don't drop any further than 4 or 5, which again leads to an interesting, kind of an interesting conversation here, and one that me and some people were having when you fast forward to the end of the season. So let's say that we have Ohio State and Clemson undefeated. They're in the playoffs, number 1, number 2, whatever the rankings end up being, and then you have really 4 teams in my mind really vying for 2 spots. You have Michigan, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. So let's say, just for argument's sake here, Tennessee loses to Georgia, and it's a 10-point game, and then basically that solidifies Georgia and Alabama in the SEC championship game. And let's say Alabama beats Georgia by 10 or less in that championship game. And then you also have Michigan with, let's just say they have one loss to Ohio State, fairly close. Again, let's just say within that 10 point range there. Who's your two teams that are in the playoffs, and who's your two teams on the out? I mean, I think for me, and I'll let you kind of give your thoughts as well here, but I put a lot of, I know everybody doesn't. I put a lot of stock in winning a conference championship. Um, but the fact that if you're Alabama, you win that conference championship, but you lost head to head to Tennessee, I would I would tend to think the way that we've seen that happen in the past, that you would see in that situation, you would probably see Georgia and Alabama as your playoff your next two playoff participants um, with Tennessee and Michigan on the way out. But I mean, that's an incredibly strong resume that Tennessee would put on the table as a potential 11-1 team with wins against Alabama, with I mean how LSU's playing right now, just a dominating win against LSU, a dominating win against Kentucky, and who knows what they do in the rest of these games. But um, again, that would be something interesting to see if that happened.
Yeah, so the SEC gets a ton of respect and credit. And then you've got basically a matchup of comparing possible one-loss teams in the SEC versus undefeateds, let's say in the ACC and the Big 12. So, what is the committee going to do with Clemson and TCU as undefeated champions versus one-loss SEC teams that do not win the conference? The if chalk ensues, which it won't, most likely. We've only got 4 games left, but we do have conference championship game weekend. But if we do have chalk, then we're going to have an undefeated Clemson ACC champion, an undefeated TCU as a Big 12 champion. Although I don't know if I can speak for you. They've navigated it this far, but they've made it 8 weeks. They've got 5 left to go, and they've got Texas and even some other teams. TCU's no juggernaut that they can just look past anyone. They had a 34-31 game with just a minute left or whatever against West Virginia. They barely made it past them. So they can't look past anyone. They're not that good. And then they've got a Big 12 championship game where they're going to have to meet somebody that they already beat and defeat them again to get there most likely, versus what could play out in the SEC and the Big 10, that those teams are going to get a ton of respect from this committee because they already do. And wow, to see an Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee situation that you just played out, which is not probable, but it's very likely, where you've got an Alabama winner, they're in, and you've got Georgia sitting there at 12-1 and Tennessee at 11-1, and Georgia's got the extra win and went to the championship game, but Tennessee's got the wins that they do. And then this Ohio State, Michigan, unless something crazy happens in the Big Ten championship game, that's going to be 13-0 probably, and 11-1 out of those two. And you're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 teams for 4 spots.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's not likely because they all have to avoid upsets except for when they play each other, but it's somewhat likely. Maybe TCU slips off and they lose, but still you got a Clemson Big 10 SEC issue to sort through.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. I mean, I think unless some things happen that we don't expect, and certainly LSU's capable of beating Alabama this week, right? I mean, Alabama's lost. They've lost the one, and they've been very close to losing a couple more.
But how about that scenario if LSU runs the table and they're the SEC champion at 11-2?
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a interesting. But I think when you look at TCU, I feel like, kind of getting back to the Big 12, I think TCU. I look at them very similarly to Cincinnati over the last couple of years. I think they're going to have some things happen in a very chaotic way for them to make their way into that Final Four. I think the Big 12 this year, although maybe a little bit better than it's been um, in the past in terms of just kind of top to bottom strength, maybe not necessarily at the top, but just overall conference strength is you're going to have more weight on the Big Ten. You're going to have more weight on the SEC, obviously. So I think if you have a Michigan that is 11-1 with a fairly close loss to Ohio State, I think you probably look at that situation. Would a Michigan 11-1 get in over a 12 or 13-0 TCU? Um, it's debatable, right? I mean, I think when you look at TCU's resume, um, that'll be interesting to see to evaluate that as the season goes on, right? Because you looked at that Oklahoma State win. That's a really good win for TCU, especially the way that they came back. Um, and then they go out and they lose 48 to nothing to Kansas State, which was one of the weirdest, inexplicable losses I've seen by a large margin in a long time.
Yeah.
So what's the value that Oklahoma State brings in that win, brings to the table, right? I mean, I think Oklahoma at the time, maybe it was a really good win, but now maybe not as good of a win as you thought it was at the time. I think Kansas State still that's the one that's a good win for them, specifically the way that they came back in that game and won that games. But so yeah, they're wanting chaos. They want a Notre Dame win this weekend. They want a LSU win this weekend. They want you know, I mean, I don't know that it matters from a Georgia Tennessee perspective there, but you probably think that you're probably getting two teams in the SEC in. I would, unless you know something something crazy happens. I think there's probably two of those schools that are getting in between Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee, and even in a crazy situation, LSU. To your point, but that's why they play the games, right? And it'll be, especially this, what they call Championship November is going to be really, really exciting across the board, even if it's not necessarily as interesting here locally for Oklahoma sake. I think it's still interesting for me. Tennessee just looks like one of those teams this year that is they've just gotten so much better. They remind me a little bit, Mark, of that LSU team a few years ago in terms of their defense isn't great, but I think it's good enough. And it's getting a little bit better each and every week. That they were really bad against Florida, but they're getting better each and every week. And they were really impressive against Kentucky this last weekend. I know Kentucky's not an offensive juggernaut, but still holding them to 6 points I thought was pretty impressive. So they look a lot like that team of LSU. I believe what was that 2018 the Joe
19.
Burrow team.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we'll see how that goes. I'm really looking forward to that game against Georgia because Georgia doesn't. I mean, they're still really really good. Don't get me wrong, really good. They don't. It's interesting to see if Stetson Bennett is going to be the guy that will be able to kind of carry them to a win if they're not able to. if they're not able to just dominate with a running game in their defense. One of the best defenses in the country against the best offense in the country right now statistically. So I think that'll be a really, really good game.
We've never seen a major conference champion go undefeated and not be selected to the playoff. That's what we could see here. TCU is the most likely candidate, and Clemson would be next, but I can't imagine them missing at 13-0. But I would feel bad for TCU and feel it to be unjust if they don't make the playoff at 13-0. Don't know what else they're supposed to do. But in addition to them rooting for Clemson to get knocked off or something to happen in the SEC where it's only one or two teams involved and not all three, and something in the Big Ten that's going to help them, which again is not really foreseen with Ohio State and Michigan. It looks like they're only going to lose the game against each other, and otherwise it's hard to imagine one of those two teams losing. TCU desperately needs something to happen in those three conferences. And then they also need, I guess it's going to be Kansas State and Oklahoma State to win the rest of their games to prop up their two best wins. Because otherwise, Oklahoma State and Kansas State they're no juggernauts. They're not great teams. They could lose a game or two. There could be a 9-3 team in the Big 12 championship game playing TCU. And they would get credit for that win, but it wouldn't be the kind of credit that you typically get playing in a conference championship game. Wouldn't give them that kind of boost.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think, because when you play that conference championship game, I think the benefit that you get, Mark, especially if you're trying to fight your way into playoff consideration, is you really want to be able to, maybe if you've got a loss or maybe a game that you didn't play, be able to really avenge that loss. Like one of the things that Oklahoma, that's been the benefit for them over a couple of years, is they've been able to avenge a loss in the regular season. They had when they lost to Texas early in the year, they were able to go and avenge that loss. They lost to Iowa State. They were able to avenge that loss. So I think those things are very important. So exactly to your point, if TCU ends up playing, let's just say they play Kansas State, and they win that game in the Big 12 championship game. Well, I think the committee says, okay, we've already seen that. We've already seen that happen. And so, what does that do for them? But yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head. I think you really have a situation where they just have to have some chaos happen, and have to have some things that in the interim they have to look really impressive on their side.
What matters to you in all this? So I certainly have thought of ways that I think are better playoff formats, but beyond that discussion that we've had a number of times and will continue to have in the off season and with a 12-team playoff coming. But if you had to work within these parameters and you were on the playoff committee, how would you approach this? What would be important to you?
I think number one, I think there should not be any necessarily any AP coaches poll rankings. I think that clouds judgment, to a certain degree, because there are certain teams, that come in, and we talked about preseason rankings. It's a lot about reputation. It's a lot about what this team has done in the past, and not necessarily what this team has done this year, right? So I think that's one thing. I think for me, conference championships are something that are very valid to me. I think those. I think a conference championship in certain instances kind of are a tiebreaker, in a certain way. So I think those those things. And I know there's a lot, and I don't know if this is part of it. I know a lot of people are very, and me as a coach, I'm very much into analytics as well. But I think you've got to be able to take that away from it a little bit, and really just at the look at the eye test. Who do you think is the better team? Not necessarily, oh, this team beat this team by 3 points on the road on October, but here we are towards the end of November, first week in December. Like, who's playing the best at the right time? Um, and I don't know if there's a way to do this, Mark, but I think subconsciously it'll never happen. I mean, just because they're human. Um, but we got to find a way to stop comparing teams based on the school, based on, okay, when you look at, if you were to look at, lay down every single box score of the season, and you didn't label TCU and Alabama, I think almost probably 95% of people would probably have put TCU ahead of Alabama, not only win-loss record, but just just how Alabama struggled in some of those games. So it's an imperfect system. There's always going to be, whether you have 4 teams, whether you have 8 or 12 or 16, there's always going to be a next person, that next team that has a legitimate argument for getting in. So I don't think there's any number that will ever be a perfect number. But getting some of that bias out of it, and I think there's a lot of bias, in that room based on the people that have been selected to be part of that committee as well. So I think there's certain aspects for me that I think that this is better than the BCS, but I think there's certain aspects where the BCS was maybe a little bit more impartial, because it was certainly based on numbers and things like that. But the rankings are always going to be part of it.